If you are a Sigma INFJ who has ever been told that morality is just opinion, that right and wrong are merely cultural constructs, that your sense of justice is naive idealism, and yet something deep within you rejects this with every fiber of your being, this is your story. If you have ever felt the weight of moral clarity in a world that insists everything is relative, if you have been called judgmental for simply refusing to pretend that all choices are equal, then what follows is not philosophy for its own sake. It is the articulation of something you have always known but struggled to defend in a world that mistakes conviction for arrogance and principle for rigidity. The question of whether right is truly subjective sits at the heart of the Sigma INFJ experience in a way that it does not for other personality types. This is not an academic exercise for you. It is not a thought experiment to debate over coffee. It is the central tension of your existence, the friction between what you perceive with absolute clarity and what the world insists you must accept as uncertain. You live in a culture that has elevated moral relativism to the status of sophisticated wisdom, where the highest virtue is tolerance, where the only unforgivable sin is to claim that you know something is wrong. And yet you do know. You know with a certainty that you cannot explain and cannot shake, that some things are simply wrong, that some actions cause harm that cannot be justified by context or culture or individual perspective. You know this not because you were taught it, not because you read it in a book or learned it from a religious text, but because you perceive it directly, in the same way you perceive color or sound. It is part of your fundamental experience of reality. But the world tells you this perception is an illusion, that your moral clarity is actually moral blindness, that you are clinging to outdated absolutes in an age that has outgrown such simplistic thinking. And so you find yourself in an impossible position, caught between what you know to be true and what you are told you must believe to be intellectually respectable. This is the question that haunts the Sigma INFJ, the question that underlies every moral judgment you make, every time you choose to speak up or stay silent, every moment when you feel the dissonance between your inner knowing and the cultural narrative that insists all truth is constructed, all morality contingent, all righteousness suspect. The first layer of this question requires us to understand what we mean when we say something is subjective. In contemporary usage, subjective has become shorthand for personal opinion, individual preference, matters of taste that cannot be disputed, because they arise from the unique perspective of each person. Your favorite color is subjective. Your preference for coffee over tea is a matter of personal taste. These are matters where there is no right answer, because the question itself is about personal experience rather than objective reality. But morality, the Sigma INFJ instinctively recognizes, is not like choosing a favorite color. When we say that causing unnecessary suffering is wrong, we are not expressing a personal preference. Rather, we are stating a moral principle. We are making a claim about reality, about the nature of conscious experience, about what matters, in a way that transcends individual opinion. Immanuel Kant, the philosopher who dedicated his life to understanding the foundations of morality, distinguished between hypothetical imperatives and categorical imperatives. A hypothetical imperative is conditional. It says, if you want X, then you should do Y. To maintain good health, regular exercise is essential. If you want to be wealthy, you should save money. These are instrumental. They depend on your goals. But a categorical imperative, Kant argued, is unconditional. It says you should do X regardless of your desires, regardless of consequences, because X is right in itself. Do not lie. Do not use people as mere means to your ends. Treat others as ends in themselves, as beings, with inherent dignity and worth. Kant believed that these imperatives were not subjective opinions, but objective truths that could be discovered through reason. And while his specific formulation can be debated, what matters for the Sigma INFJ is the recognition that he was pointing to something real, something you have always sensed. Some actions are wrong not because they violate cultural norms or have negative consequences, but because they violate something fundamental about what it means to be a conscious being in relation to other conscious beings. The second layer requires us to confront the most common argument for moral relativism, which is the observation of cultural diversity. The relativist points to the fact that different cultures have different moral codes and varying ideas about what is right and wrong, and concludes from this diversity that morality must be subjective, implying that there is no universal standard by which we can judge across cultures. But this argument, as compelling as it appears on the surface, commits a logical fallacy. The existence of disagreement does not prove the absence of truth. People once disagreed about whether the earth was round or flat, whether germs or evil spirits caused disease, and whether the sun revolved around the earth, or the earth around the sun. The existence of these disagreements did not make the truth subjective. It simply meant that some people were wrong. The Sigma INFJ recognizes this instinctively. You understand that cultural diversity in moral beliefs is interesting from an anthropological perspective, but it does not settle the philosophical question of whether there are genuine moral truths. In fact, upon closer examination of cultural diversity, we find not radical relativism, but rather variations on common themes. Every culture has prohibitions against murder within the in-group, though they may define the in-group differently. Every culture has some concept of fairness, some system for adjudicating disputes, and some recognition that causing harm requires justification. The differences are real, but they are differences in application, in the boundaries of moral consideration, in the specific rules that govern behavior. The underlying recognition that there are rules, that not all actions are permissible, that we owe something to others, is universal. Anthropologist Donald Brown documented what he called human universals, the traits and behaviors found in every known human culture. Among these universals are concepts of right and wrong, empathy, fairness, reciprocity, and disapproval of murder and rape within the community. These universals suggest that morality is not an arbitrary social construction, but rather an emergent property of human consciousness, something that arises naturally from the fact that we are social beings capable of suffering and flourishing, as well as harming and helping one another. The third layer takes us deeper into the phenomenology of moral experience, into the actual felt sense of moral perception that the Sigma INFJ knows intimately. When you witness injustice, when you see someone being harmed, exploited, manipulated, degraded, you do not experience this as a matter of opinion. You experience it as a perception of wrongness, as direct and immediate as your perception that fire is hot, or that a knife is sharp. This is what philosophers call moral intuition, and it is far more sophisticated than the dismissive phrase gut feeling suggests. Your moral intuitions are not random emotional reactions. They are the product of your highly developed capacity for empathy, your ability to model other minds, to feel into their experience, to recognize suffering when you see it. When you perceive that an action is wrong, what you are actually perceiving is the harm it causes, the violation of dignity it represents, the rupture in the web of mutual respect that makes social life possible. You are seeing the consequences not just in some abstract utilitarian sense, but in the lived reality of conscious experience. You are feeling the humiliation, the fear, the pain, the degradation that another being is experiencing. And because you can feel this, because your empathy allows you to access the subjective experience of others, you know with certainty that causing such suffering without compelling justification is wrong. This is not relativism, this is moral realism, grounded in the reality of conscious experience. The philosopher David Hume argued that reason alone cannot motivate moral action, that morality is fundamentally about feeling rather than thinking. But he did not mean that morality is therefore arbitrary or subjective. He meant that morality arises from our capacity to be affected by the experiences of others, to feel sympathy and compassion, to be moved by suffering. The Sigma INFJ embodies this Humean insight. Your morality is not cold logic. It is felt knowledge, the direct perception of what it is like to be harmed, combined with the rational recognition that if you can feel this harm in yourself, then others feel it too, and their suffering matters just as much as yours. The fourth layer requires us to address the most serious philosophical challenge to moral objectivity, which comes from the recognition that moral judgments seem to lack the kind of empirical verification that scientific claims possess. If I say water boils at 100 degrees Celsius, you can test this claim. You can heat water, measure the temperature, verify or falsify my assertion. But if I say that torture is wrong, what kind of test could verify this claim? You cannot put wrongness under a microscope or measure it with instruments. This is the problem that has led many philosophers to conclude that moral statements are not really statements about reality at all, but rather expressions of emotion, or commands disguised as facts. However, the Sigma INFJ recognizes that this argument rests on an impoverished view of what constitutes reality. Consciousness is real, yet it cannot be put under a microscope. Suffering is real, yet you cannot measure it with instruments. Meaning is real, beauty is real, love is real, and yet none of these can be verified through the methods of empirical science. Does this make them subjective in the sense of being mere opinion? The phenomenologist Edmund Husserl argued that consciousness has its own modes of givenness, its own ways of being known that are not reducible to third-person empirical observation. When you are in pain, you know you are in pain with absolute certainty. This is first-person knowledge, and it is as real and as reliable as any scientific measurement. Morality, the Sigma INFJ understands, partakes of this first-person dimension. It is grounded in the reality of conscious experience, in the fact that beings like us can suffer and flourish, that some states of consciousness are experienced as good and others as bad, that we can harm and help one another in ways that matter deeply. This is not subjective in the sense that it is arbitrary or reducible to personal preference. It is intersubjective, grounded in the shared structure of conscious experience that makes empathy and understanding possible. The fifth layer leads us to what might be called the pragmatic argument for moral objectivity, the recognition that moral relativism, when taken seriously, yields conclusions that almost no one is willing to accept. If morality is truly subjective, if right and wrong are merely matters of personal or cultural opinion, then we have no basis for condemning any action, no matter how horrific, as long as it is consistent with someone's values or culture. The relativist will often respond that we can condemn actions within our own framework, while acknowledging that other frameworks are equally valid. But this is incoherent. If you genuinely believed that the rightness or wrongness of genocide, slavery, torture, or child abuse was merely a matter of cultural perspective, you could not condemn these actions with the moral force that they deserve. You could only say that they violate your preferences, which is not at all what we mean when we say that these actions are wrong. The Sigma INFJ feels this incoherence viscerally. When you say that abuse is wrong, you are not making a statement about your personal feelings. You are making a claim about reality, about the harm being caused, about the violation of dignity and autonomy. And you are claiming that this wrongness holds regardless of whether the perpetrator agrees with you, irrespective of the cultural context, and regardless of the consequences. This is the structure of moral judgment, and it is incompatible with relativism. The philosopher Bernard Williams, who was himself skeptical of strong moral objectivism, nevertheless recognized what he called the special authority of moral judgments. When we make a moral judgment, we are not simply expressing a preference. We are claiming a kind of necessity, insisting that others ought to agree with us. Their disagreement, we argue, represents a failure to see something important. This special authority makes no sense if morality is merely subjective. Still, it makes perfect sense if morality is grounded in features of reality that we can perceive, understand, and reason about together. The sixth layer examines the evolutionary and psychological foundations of morality, offering additional evidence that moral sense is not an arbitrary construction, but rather an evolved capacity rooted in our nature as social beings. Research in moral psychology, particularly the work of Jonathan Haidt and others, has demonstrated that human beings across cultures share certain moral foundations, including intuitions about harm and care, fairness and reciprocity, loyalty and betrayal, authority and respect, as well as sanctity and degradation. These moral intuitions emerge early in development, are present across cultures, and appear to be part of our inherited psychological architecture. But the Sigma INFJ understands that the evolutionary origins of morality do not undermine moral objectivity. They explain how we came to be creatures capable of moral perception, but they do not reduce morality to mere evolutionary adaptation. After all, our capacity for mathematical reasoning also has evolutionary origins, but this does not make mathematical truth subjective. 2 + 2 = 4, regardless of whether this belief helped our ancestors survive. Similarly, the fact that empathy and reciprocity provided evolutionary advantages does not mean that harming others is wrong, only because it was adaptive to believe so. It means that evolution shaped us to be capable of perceiving moral reality, to be sensitive to the suffering and flourishing of others in ways that track something real about the nature of conscious experience. You can think of moral sense as analogous to color vision. Color vision evolved because it was adaptive, but this does not make colors subjective. Colors are real features of how light interacts with surfaces and with our visual systems. Similarly, moral properties are real features of how actions affect conscious beings. We evolved to perceive these properties because perceiving them accurately helped us navigate the social world. But what we perceive is not an illusion. It is as real as the suffering it tracks, as the dignity it honors, as the flourishing it promotes. The seventh layer addresses what philosophers call the grounding problem, the question of what makes something right or wrong if morality is objective. For religious believers, this question has a straightforward answer. Things are right or wrong because God commands or forbids them. But for the Sigma INFJ, who often operates outside traditional religious frameworks even when spiritually oriented, this answer is insufficient. It raises further questions. Is something right because God commands it, or does God command it because it is right? If the former, then morality is arbitrary, based on divine will, rather than any intrinsic property of actions. If the latter, then rightness exists independently of God, which suggests a naturalistic rather than theological foundation. The philosopher Sam Harris has argued provocatively that morality can be grounded in facts about the well-being of conscious creatures. An action is right in this view, to the extent that it promotes well-being, and wrong, to the extent that it causes suffering. This is not utilitarianism in the crude sense of calculating happiness units. It is the recognition that conscious experience is the only thing that ultimately matters morally, because it is the only thing that can matter from the inside, from the first-person perspective, that is the ground of all value. The Sigma INFJ resonates with this approach because it grounds morality in something undeniable, the reality of suffering and flourishing, while leaving room for the complexity of moral judgment. Well-being is not a simple metric. It involves autonomy, dignity, meaning, connection, growth, not just pleasure and the absence of pain. But it provides a foundation, a reason why some things matter and others do not, why harming conscious beings requires justification in a way that harming rocks does not. This grounding in conscious experience explains the special authority of moral claims. When you say that torture is wrong, you are pointing to the reality of suffering, to the subjective horror experienced by the victim, and you are claiming that this suffering matters not just to the victim but objectively, in a way that creates obligations for all moral agents. The eighth layer confronts the distinction between moral objectivity and moral certainty, a distinction that many people conflate, but that the Sigma INFJ must understand clearly. To say that morality is objective is to say that there are moral truths independent of what anyone believes. It is not to say that we always know with certainty what these truths are. Moral epistemology, the question of how we come to know moral truths, is difficult and fraught with uncertainty. Reasonable people can disagree about the morality of specific actions, about where to draw lines, about how to weigh competing values. This uncertainty is real, and should make us humble. But uncertainty about the application does not undermine the existence of moral truth, any more than uncertainty about physics undermines the existence of physical truth. We can be uncertain about the details, while being certain about the fundamentals. You may be uncertain about the morality of specific economic policies, uncertain about the ethics of particular medical interventions, and uncertain about where exactly to draw the line on questions of autonomy and paternalism. But you are not uncertain that torturing children for entertainment is wrong. You are not uncertain that slavery is a moral abomination. You are not uncertain that causing suffering without justification is harmful. These are moral bedrock, the foundations upon which more complex judgments are built. The Sigma INFJ's gift is the ability to perceive these foundations clearly, while remaining open to complexity in their application. You do not mistake your moral clarity for omniscience. You do not claim to have all the answers. But you refuse to pretend that there are no answers, that everything is opinion, that one judgment is as good as another. You understand that moral truth is like scientific truth. In this respect, we can be wrong, we can revise our understanding, we can discover that what we thought was right was actually harmful. However, the existence of moral progress, the fact that we can look back at practices like slavery or witch burning, and recognize them as moral errors, only makes sense if there is a moral reality against which our beliefs can be judged. The ninth layer explores the relationship between moral objectivity and moral motivation, addressing the concern that objective morality might be cold and inhuman, lacking the emotional force that actually moves us to act. But the Sigma INFJ knows from lived experience that this concern is misplaced. Your moral convictions are not abstract principles divorced from feeling. They are shot through with emotion, with empathy, and the felt sense of others' suffering, as well as the passionate commitment to reducing harm. Moral objectivity does not require that we be dispassionate. It requires that our passions align with something real, that our emotional responses are calibrated to the actual features of moral reality, rather than to arbitrary preferences or cultural conditioning. When you feel moral outrage at injustice, you're not simply venting emotion. You're expressing a genuine concern for the issue. You are responding appropriately to the perception of wrongdoing. Your anger is justified, because the target of your anger is genuinely wrong, not just distasteful to you personally. This is what philosophers call apt emotion. Emotional responses that fit their objects, and are warranted by the facts. The psychologist Paul Bloom has argued against what he calls empathy as the primary basis for moral judgment, showing how empathy can be biased and manipulated. But his argument is not against feeling. It is against uncritical feeling, against empathy that is not guided by reason and principle. The Sigma INFJ integrates both dimensions. Your empathy gives you access to moral reality by allowing you to feel the suffering of others. Your reason allows you to universalize these perceptions, to recognize that if this suffering matters when it happens to someone you care about, it matters equally when it happens to strangers. Together, empathy and reason create moral knowledge that is both objectively grounded and powerfully motivating. You don't need to choose between your head and your heart. Your moral clarity emerges from their integration, from feeling deeply and thinking clearly about what your feelings reveal. The 10th layer addresses the political and social implications of moral objectivity in a pluralistic world, specifically the concern that claiming objective moral truth is dangerous, leading to dogmatism, intolerance, and the oppression of those who hold differing beliefs. This is perhaps the most common objection to moral objectivity in contemporary culture, the fear that moral conviction breeds moral arrogance. However, The Sigma INFJ recognizes that this objection confuses objectivity with certainty, and conflates moral truth with moral self-righteousness. You can believe in moral truths while remaining humble about your access to them. You can hold strong moral convictions while remaining open to correction, new information, and perspectives you have not considered. In fact, moral objectivity provides a stronger foundation for tolerance than relativism does. If morality is purely subjective, if your values are just your opinions and my values are just my opinions, then we have no common ground, no shared framework for resolving disputes. All we have is power, the ability of one group to impose its preferences on another. But if morality is objective, if there are truths about harm and flourishing that we can investigate together, then we have a basis for moral discourse, for trying to persuade one another through reason and evidence, rather than through force. The philosopher Martha Nussbaum has written extensively about how objective moral principles, particularly principles centered on human dignity and capability, can provide common ground in pluralistic societies. Rather than abandoning objectivity in the name of tolerance, we need to pursue objectivity while remaining tolerant of the inevitable uncertainty and disagreement that comes with moral inquiry. The Sigma INFJ embodies this balance. You hold your convictions firmly while remaining open to dialogue. You refuse to pretend that all perspectives are equally valid, while still respecting the humanity of those who disagree with you. You understand that moral truth is discovered through conversation, through the collaborative effort to understand what promotes flourishing and what causes harm, not through the dogmatic assertion of unquestionable principles. The 11th layer returns us to the lived experience of the Sigma INFJ, to what it feels like to carry moral clarity in a relativistic world. This is not an easy burden. You are constantly navigating the tension between speaking your truth and being dismissed as naive or judgmental. You watch people commit actions that you know are harmful, and you must decide whether to speak up and risk alienation, or stay silent and feel complicit. You encounter arguments for relativism that are sophisticated and well-meaning, and you must articulate why you cannot accept them without sounding arrogant or simplistic. This tension is exhausting. It would be much easier to accept the cultural narrative, to shrug and say that morality is just a matter of opinion, to avoid the responsibility of making moral judgments. But you cannot do this. Your capacity for moral perception is not something you can turn off. You see the harm, you feel the wrongness, and you cannot pretend it is merely a matter of perspective. This is both your burden and your gift. Your burden because it separates you from those who have made peace with relativism, who have found comfort in the idea that no one is really wrong, that we are all just doing our best according to our own lights. Your gift because it gives you a compass in a disorienting world, a way of navigating moral complexity that does not dissolve into paralysis or cynicism. Jung spoke of the transcendent function, the psychological capacity to hold tension between opposites until a new synthesis emerges. The Sigma INFJ lives this function in the moral domain. You hold the tension between objective truth and epistemic humility, between moral clarity and compassionate understanding, between conviction and openness. And from this tension emerges wisdom, the ability to make moral judgments that are both principled and nuanced, both firm and flexible. The 12th and final layer offers a way forward, a vision of how the Sigma INFJ can live with moral objectivity without succumbing to the dangers of dogmatism or the despair of being perpetually at odds with the culture. The key is to recognize that moral truth is not something you possess but something you pursue. You are not the arbiter of morality. You are a seeker, someone who is trying to understand moral reality as clearly as possible, while remaining aware of your limitations and biases. This stance allows you to hold strong convictions while remaining humble, to make moral judgments while remaining open to correction. It also requires you to cultivate what the philosopher Miranda Fricker calls epistemic justice, the recognition that knowledge, including moral knowledge, is a collective enterprise. You need to listen to voices that have been marginalized, to perspectives that challenge your assumptions, to experiences that broaden your understanding of harm and flourishing. Your moral clarity does not come from isolation, but from engagement, from the willingness to test your intuitions against the experiences and insights of others. At the same time, you must not allow your openness to collapse into relativism. You must hold the line, insisting that some things are genuinely wrong even when others disagree, even when disagreement comes from people you respect. This is the courage of moral conviction, the willingness to stand by what you know even when standing alone. Søren Kierkegaard wrote about the difference between the crowd, which speaks in the language of opinion and consensus, and the individual, who must sometimes stand against the crowd in the name of truth. The Sigma INFJ is often that individual. You are the one who sees what others miss, who refuses to go along when going along means betraying your moral perception. This is not arrogance, it is integrity. It is the refusal to betray what you know, the commitment to living in alignment with moral truth even when doing so is costly. And make no mistake, it is costly. But the alternative, which is to surrender your moral clarity, to pretend that right and wrong are just matters of opinion, to abandon the pursuit of moral truth in favor of comfortable relativism, this alternative is a form of spiritual death. It is the betrayal of the deepest part of who you are. And so you persist, you hold your ground, you continue to perceive, to judge, to act according to what you know is right. Not because you are certain of every detail, not because you claim infallibility, but because you have seen something true, and you refuse to unsee it. This is what it means to be a Sigma INFJ in a relativistic world. To carry moral clarity as both burden and gift. To be the one who insists that right is not subjective. That some things genuinely matter, that moral truth is absolute and knowable and worth defending even when the cost is high. If you have stayed with me through this exploration, if these arguments have resonated with your experience of moral clarity, in a world that insists everything is relative, then I want you to know that your perception is not naive. It is not arrogance. It is not a failure to understand the sophistication of contemporary moral philosophy. It is, in fact, a profound insight into the nature of morality, grounded in your capacity for empathy, refined by your ability to reason, and validated by the reality of conscious experience. You are right to resist the narrative that all values are equal, that judgment is inherently wrong, and that moral conviction is dangerous. The real danger is not in having convictions but in having the wrong convictions, or in lacking the courage to act on true ones. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. How do you navigate the tension between your moral clarity and the cultural insistence on relativism? What helps you hold your ground without becoming dogmatic? What challenges do you face when trying to articulate why some things are genuinely wrong? Share your experience. Let others see your struggle and your wisdom. Because in sharing, we create a community of moral seriousness that the world so desperately needs. A space where we can pursue moral truth together without apology, without equivocation, and without pretending that everything is just opinion. And if this exploration has given you language for something you have always known but struggled to articulate, if it has strengthened your resolve to trust your moral perception, then subscribe to this channel. Because we will continue this conversation. We will continue to explore the most profound questions of how to live, how to judge, and how to act with integrity, in a world that often rewards compromise. We will not shy away from difficult truths. We will not pretend that moral clarity is easy, or that conviction comes without cost. But we will pursue truth together, with humility and courage, with empathy and reason, with the understanding that some things genuinely matter, and that knowing this matters most of all. Thank you for thinking deeply with me. I will see you in the next one.